Nicholas Kristof and Sheryl WuDunn might be best known for their international Pulitzer Prize-winning journalism, but their latest work takes place closer to home.
It's true, we have been traveling around the world, covering all sorts of different issues, and in the developing world we were covering a lot of humanitarian related issues, and we would come back. I mean, I've been going there for decades, and you would meet these people and you would think, okay, you know, they're certainly working class, but they're smiling and no problem, they help on the farm, and it wasn't until we actually started talking to them more deeply, beyond just the work-related issues, that we discovered there is a humanitarian crisis at home.
In their own backyard, to be exact.
It was kind of an idyllic childhood on a farm in Yamhill, Oregon. Population today about 1,000 on a good day. And it was an area that had grown economically and done very well. And then everything kind of blew up.
Tightrope is a story of how Americans have lost hope through drug abuse, alcoholism, and the loss of jobs.
It's kind of paradoxical. Here in the US we have plumbing, we have electricity, we have running water, and we have flat screen TVs. But the one thing that a lot of Americans, particularly in these areas, don't have is hope. And so we've got people from the developing world desperately trying to come to the US, clamoring at the gate, so to speak, because they believe in the American dream. But here, with these Americans who are struggling, for them, the dream is broken.
But the story doesn't end there. In this one-on-one interview, Kristof and WuDunn not only address the crisis in working-class America, they lay a framework of policy solutions that could mend half a century of governmental failure.
And that was one reason we wrote Tightrope, to try to encourage people to face both the challenges out there, the human challenges, but also the opportunity we have to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Sheryl and Nick, for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yes, a pleasure.
So you are probably best known for your international and Pulitzer Prize-winning work in China, Darfur. But this is actually a super personal book that you wrote, and it literally took place in your backyard. Nick, can you kind of describe your childhood for us in Yamhill, Oregon?
Yeah, it was kind of an idyllic childhood on a farm in Yamhill, Oregon. Population today about 1,000 on a good day. We had sheep and cherries and timber on the farm. And it was an area that had grown economically and done very well. Everybody on my old school bus was kind of looking forward to a better era. The biggest local employers were agriculture, timber, and light manufacturing. And then everything kind of blew up.
How so?
Jobs went away. The biggest employer, the glove factory, closed down. Agriculture and timber hired fewer people. The steel mill laid off a lot of people. And there were new industries that came in, but if you were one of those who had worked in the old industries, you could not find a job. And the men in particular, I think, felt very acutely not only the loss of money, but the loss of dignity and respect that came with a good job. And people self-medicated, and then they just spiraled down where the social fabric in Yamhill had been very, very strong, and it just unraveled incredibly quickly. So the people who got on the bus right after me were the Knapps, and they were, their dad had a job laying pipe, a union job, earned a good living. They'd bought their own home. When Farland, my classmate, turned 16, he got a Ford Mustang for his birthday. We were all very jealous. And then they all dropped out of high school because I think they thought that their dad had had a good union job. Without high school, they could too. Farland ended up dying of liver failure after years of alcohol and drug abuse. His brother Zealand died in a house fire while passed out drunk. His sister Regina died of hepatitis after needle use. And the brother Nathan blew himself up making meth. And the only survivor is Keelan, the youngest, who survived because he was in the Oregon State Penitentiary for 13 years. And watching these incredibly bright, talented kids who were on the way up and looking forward to a confident future, and see that happen and realize that that wasn't just one family. There was another family on the bus also with 5 kids, and 4 of those 5 are also now gone. It's heartbreaking. It's like there's a great depression out there that is affecting bits and pieces of the country, and yet, at least in the Great Depression, we were trying to fight back, and now it's like we're barely paying attention.
It's overlooked. Sheryl, you've been going to Yamhill for 30 years. When did you realize that there was this epidemic in this place that you're so familiar with?
Well, it's true. We have been traveling around the world, covering all sorts of different issues. And in the developing world, we were covering a lot of humanitarian related issues. And we would come back. I mean, I've been going there for decades. And you would meet these people, and you would think, okay, they're certainly working class, but they're smiling and no problem. They help on the farm, and it wasn't until we actually started talking to them more deeply, beyond just the work-related issues, that we discovered there is a humanitarian crisis at home. And you start going into their households, and you sort of meet them, you talk with them, and you realize that it is far more severe. And their pain and suffering there is just as radical as what we found overseas. I used to say that it was dimension much more severe overseas in the developing world, but actually with the human condition it's really terrible here as well. The one thing that it's kind of paradoxical. Here in the U.S. we have plumbing, we have electricity, we have running water, and we have flat screen TVs. But the one thing that a lot of Americans, particularly in these areas, don't have is hope. And so we've got people from the developing world desperately trying to come to the U.S., clamoring at the gate, so to speak, because they believe in the American dream. But here, with these Americans who are struggling, for them, the dream is broken.
How do we give Americans back their hope that they've lost? What do we say to those Americans who believe our system is, I hate to say it, but it's rightfully rigged?
Well, first of all, I think that we do have to speak to them more on their level. I think often, people from sort of the upper classes, even the politicians, they kind of speak down to them, and they don't take them seriously, face to face, eye to eye, as that, I really want to listen to what your problems are. That is one thing that President Trump does very well. Even the language he uses, he speaks in their language, in their vernacular, with the curse words and all. Whereas the hyper-articulate, educated candidates that we see, at least right now in the Democratic primary, they are, they don't even know how to speak in the vernacular the way these people do. And so I think they just have an affinity for Trump. And we see how this does affect all of us, not just the people who are struggling, because they did help elect Trump. If you actually do a map of the United States, the reason a lot of Nick's friends died is something that Angus Deaton and Case, 2 economists from Princeton, called deaths of despair. So they looked at census data and they discovered that there are rising mortality rates for middle-aged whites. And it's also, actually happening with blacks as well. And the primary reasons for death are alcohol-related deaths, overdose from drugs, and suicides. And so we have this phenomenon, and this is not just in, this is actually around the country, but if you overlay a map of those deaths of despair with the, Trump voting areas, they're very close. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. So clearly the disgruntled workers, they don't see anyone else speaking to them except for Trump, even though he makes these empty promises that really aren't fulfilled.
So speaking of deaths of despair, let's talk about Kevin Green for a little bit. He succumbed to alcohol abuse, some overeating, loneliness really, and he passed away. And on Facebook, you posted a remembrance of Kevin. And you were met with some very cruel comments. How do you think that reflects on our society?
I think that in Tightrope, we argue that America took a wrong turn over the last 50 years. And it took a wrong turn in policy, but it also took a wrong turn in social narrative. And we became obsessed with a personal responsibility narrative, and that it's all about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, and that it's all about what you do. And sometimes that can be empowering to somebody. Often it becomes an excuse to point fingers rather than to point a helping hand. And for those workers who can't do as well as their parents did, then there becomes kind of a crisis of self-esteem, and they tend to internalize that narrative, and they blame themselves, and that is what is likely to lead them to this self-medication, to the spiral downward. And in the Great Depression, there were these various social institutions, churches, community organizations that might help. Those have frayed. So people like Kevin, I think, were intensely lonely. And because the family structure also tended to collapse for both the white and black working classes, that meant a lot less extended family support. And there's been a lot of research in the last 15 years or so that suggests that loneliness is a much bigger problem than we had imagined, that it may kill more Americans each year than obesity does, that it may be associated with as much death as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness, drugs, alcohol, they're in a sense symptoms of something larger, a larger malaise that is probably related to the loss of good jobs.
So speaking of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, you entitle an entire chapter Up by the Bootstraps. Let's talk about this phrase, where it came from, what it meant, and what it means now.
Well, certainly in the 18th century it was used, but it was used to mean the impossible. Have you ever tried to lift yourself up by the bootstraps? It's actually impossible. So that's what it meant. It's impossible to do. But somehow over the next century or two, it basically came to mean you can do this. This is something everybody should be able to do. And so it's taken on this meaning of you can do it by yourself. You should be able to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get out of this rut that you're in. The problem is that people, obviously, since it's impossible to do, if they can't do it, that's even more self-defeating. They feel that everybody else is pulling themselves up by the bootstraps except for me. And so this narrative is very destructive. Of course, a lot of the people that we interviewed and talked to, they acknowledge that they did make bad decisions. They had self-destructive behavior. I mean, Farland, shouldn't have dropped out of high school. He shouldn't have started drugs. Absolutely. But at the same time, we are also a victim of our own, environment. And so if the environment is not more nurturing or even just more, less harsh, I do think that we can lift more Americans up and have them reaching their full potential, which is really important for the country as a whole. This is not just sort of soft, kind of mushy thing that, oh, yes, we want everybody to be nurtured. It's that it's for competitiveness. If we want our country to remain as strong as it I guess is or was, then we need strong Americans, as many as possible. Especially when you look at China with 1.4 billion people, India soon to be 1.4 billion people. We have 320 million people. Right there, we are already are behind. And so if we really want to compete and stay number one, we need to have every American operating at full steam. The other thing is that we're actually no longer number one. A number of measures, we are really far behind. The Social Progress Index, which is an index based on a framework developed by 3 Nobel laureates, and it looks at a range of measures: health metrics, education, personal safety, crime, and all that. The U.S. As a whole, out of 143 countries, is number 26. So are we proud of being number 26? We used to be number 1, but we can't say that anymore.
Can't brag about number 26. No. Let's talk about the title of this book, Tightrope. It's so apropos. Kind of go into your thought process behind it and what it really means.
Look, there are plenty of folks from very disadvantaged backgrounds who do manage to make it. And I think of it as, there are some people who manage to walk across a tightrope. And bravo to them. Congratulations. But if you're from a disadvantaged background, it really is like a tightrope walk without a net. And one slip, and that's it. Whereas if you're from a more privileged background, then it's kind of like walking down this nice path, and you're much less likely to slip. And if you do, then you just pick yourself up. And so what we can do as a society is provide some safety netting. Maybe we can make that tightrope a little wider for some people.
This whole book was gut-wrenching to read. And I can't imagine how it must have felt to write something like this.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really was. It was very painful. I mean, we know all these people, and Nick went to school with them when he was very young. And so it's watching these people grow up and seeing them, you know, when they were young and bubbly and full of energy, and then all of a sudden, what happened? And it's because it's not just the vicissitudes of life, it's really harsh policy that is just not, it's not intelligent. It's just, you know, disintelligent. It's really destructive, and we actually don't acknowledge that. And so I think I think right now we've become so divisive. We were less divisive a while back. And so if we haven't been able to recorrect course during the times when we were much more, you know, bipartisan, you know, it is going to be harder, but I don't think it's impossible. I mean, there are some areas where we do have common ground, and I think childhood education is a real case in point. Even though the kids don't vote, the parents really care about childhood education, and a number of the areas, you know, that are, you know, have strong supporters for Trump, they do have excellent programs for early childhood education. And in fact, some of them are experimenting and pioneering these methods. And so if we can just replicate those around the country, in some cities are, you know, for instance, New York is doing universal pre-K, and lots of other cities are trying to experiment with that, trying to move towards that. That's really a step forward, and it's obviously an area that everybody cares about. And if we can just build on that politically, I think that we can make progress.
This country, it was built on opportunity, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. One resounding theme that just stuck in my brain as I was reading Tightrope was that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. How did that happen, and where do we go from here?
Well, it really did start in the 1970s. Before the 1970s, after World War II, we had inclusive capitalism. I mean, the country was growing and the economy was doing really well. Everybody was lifted up, and so the pie was growing, but, you know, also the divisions, everybody's piece of pie was growing. And then in the 1970s, as growth began to stagnate, we had, you know, high inflation, slower growth, and so people got really worried, and so we adopted some policies that actually were more detrimental in the long run, such as deregulation. Some of it was needed, but we went too far. And then also tax cuts for the wealthy. That also went too far. And then also we had wrested a lot of the power from labor and gave it to business. We again went too far. And so the result was, and if you actually, there's some interesting data that show that the top 1%, their share of national income was maybe like 12, 13% back in 1980, I think it was. It goes way up over the years. And the bottom 50%, which was a little bit higher, around 30s, they go way down to like 14, 15% now. So it's stunning. And okay, so you say, well, that happened everywhere. Well, if you look at peer countries in Western Europe and in Canada, they do have, you know, the share by the wealthy is escalating a little bit, but there's never a crossing. The numbers are basically very close to where they were before, just a little bit better in the case of the wealthy and a little bit worse in the case of the bottom 50%, but nowhere near what the extremities of what we see here in the US. And so we do have a case where we have exclusive capitalism. We don't have a shared capitalism. The shareholder capitalism idea that was proposed, you know, really sort of enthusiastically pushed by Milton Friedman. Look, he's a genius, and he really did, you know, galvanize the economy in many ways, but we've gone too far. And so, you know, the push for stakeholder capitalism is really important. And you can also look at the role of unions. The role of unions really is very much seminal in terms of maintaining wage growth for workers. This 1968 wage level, if you take that, the minimum wage in 1968, if you had accounted for inflation and productivity over the years, it would now be $22. So you can make a decent living on $22 an hour, right? But of course, what is the federal minimum wage? It's $7.25. Two people, a couple, earning the minimum wage, working a full-time job 40 hours a week with two kids, there's no place in the United States that they can find a two-bedroom apartment without paying more than guidelines of 30% of your gross income. So it really is phenomenal how we have a tale of two Americas.
Another point that you addressed that the United States might have gone too far is the war on drugs. There is a zero tolerance policy when it comes to drug offenses in the United States. And you talked about Portugal, and it kind of described to me the differences, the difference in approach Portugal took as opposed to what the United States took.
Sure. I think there's a really instructive lesson there for the U.S. In the 1990s, both the U.S. and Portugal had a real drug problem, and in each case they explored what they might do. The U.S. decided to double down and lengthen sentences, go after people involved in the drug trade and lock them up forever. And in Portugal, on the other hand, there was a national commission that suggested decriminalizing drug possession, even for hard drugs like heroin, cocaine. And this was much debated, and this was a risk. Nobody knew what would happen, but Portugal did introduce a decriminalization of drugs, coupled with a big public health campaign not to use drugs. But if you have some heroin, some cocaine, you will not be arrested. You'll be steered toward treatment. Well, the upshot is that in the U.S., cracking down, we've had steadily more use of drugs and steadily more overdoses. Last year, we lost 68,000 Americans to overdoses. In Portugal, meanwhile, the number of people addicted to heroin has dropped by more than 2/3, and Portugal now has the lowest rate of overdose deaths in Western Europe. There is a lesson here, and I think it's hard to think of a area where the U.S. did more damage than with the war on drugs and mass incarceration. We destroyed the job prospects of young men of color in particular. We devastated the family structure, especially many African American families. And we created a system where young people, once they got criminal records, became pretty much unemployable and often unmarriageable in ways that severely damaged their future, but also the country as a whole.
And we're losing millions of dollars.
And and just simply in cost effectiveness, the drugs apparently cost us something like $500 billion a year, according to the White House estimate. And it's true that our approaches have become a little bit more compassionate, ironically, as more white people have been suffering from these issues. But we still have an approach to drugs that is heavily based on the law enforcement toolbox. And only about 1 in 10 Americans with a substance abuse problem gets treatment. And often the treatment is not very efficacious. It's like a month, 2 months. In fact, every dollar spent on treatment pays for itself up to 12 times over in reduced law enforcement, criminal justice, and health costs. It is crazy for us not to be investing in the treatment toolbox to try to help people recover. And, does it work perfectly? Of course not. Do people relapse? Absolutely. But when you're losing this many lives a year and spending this much money and the policy is working so poorly, surely we should be trying to start over with a more humane, compassionate approach.
You brought up that it's not a Republican issue, it's not a Democrat issue, it's not even really a race issue. Can you describe to us the correlations you saw between poor white Americans and non-white Americans?
I think there's a remarkable commonality in what happened in rural white areas like Yamhill and in urban black areas in Baltimore. Unfortunately, the white and black working classes have not tended to be aligned, and I think politicians have often managed to turn them against each other. But so Yam Hill is pretty much lily white. And so in the 1990s, when people in Yam Hill were looking at problems in the African American community, there tended to be a lot of invidious, nasty commentary about how the problem was black culture. And people made nasty comments about deadbeat dads and self-destructive behaviors, and people would just stick with their families, things would be fine. And meanwhile, the great sociologist William Julius Wilson was saying, look, it's not about culture, it's about jobs. And then when jobs leave these cities, then people flounder. And he was exactly right. And when jobs left white communities like Yam Hill, the same pathologies unfolded. And what black communities need and what white communities need is jobs that pay. And once you get work that provides dignity and an income, then an awful lot of other problems are manageable as well.
So jobs are needed. What would you say to someone who thinks or who believes this is inevitable? It's automation, it's globalization.
Well, it's clear that it's not inevitable, because if you look at our peer countries, everybody has been, a victim of globalization. I mean, Western Europe and Canada, the factories from the U.S. are not going so much to those places. They're going to Mexico, they're going to China. And so we're just going to be outclassed in terms of costs by those countries. And so those countries have dealt with it very differently. And one really good example of how there is a differing reaction and response to what's going on here is if you look at what happened after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, you had the auto workers laid off in both Detroit and also in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, and sometimes by the same company. And so we had a chance to see what happened in terms of the different response. So in Detroit, because of the unusual circumstances, they extended unemployment benefits. So people just got more cash, but they lost their job, and they also lost their health care, because health care is tied to the job. And so those families were under an enormous amount of stress. Everybody in the town was being laid off. Where are you going to find more work? In Canada, what happened was that they still had their health care. So that was less of a stressor. But then also the government had programs where they had to figure out, what can we retrain these workers for? They had really good retraining programs. They discovered that there was a demand for nursing jobs. So what they did was they put together a retraining program, and they said to auto workers, if you want to try a job in nursing, please join this retraining program, we will retrain you. And so they did, and so a lot of those auto workers were reintegrated back into the workplace much more quickly. And then years later, they're not, self-medicating, they're not, embroiled in all of these deaths of despair challenges that we have here in the U.S. So that's an example where other countries are dealing with the same issues, but a lot better. Look, they still have drug overdoses, they still have suicides, but they are, adopting policies much more sophisticated than what we've done here. And, Nick mentioned earlier the difference in Portugal, the way they deal with drugs. We actually, can change it too. I mean, we saw that the war on drugs doesn't work, but we haven't recorrected course. We need to really be much more flexible as an economy. We've always prided ourselves on how flexible this American economy is. And yes, in many ways we are. Parts of the economy are very flexible, but there are parts of the political structure that are very inflexible.
So how do we bring about that government intervention? How do we, the American people, create policy change?
I think it's really important that every person has a voice and actually calls upon their senators really to say, no, we care more about these issues than these issues. You really have to stop all this dysfunction in Washington. We really need to start focusing on the people, and you have to start focusing on all Americans and not just the elite.
And that was one reason we wrote Tightrope, to try to encourage people to face both the challenges out there, the human challenges, but also the opportunity we have to make a difference.